Julie, thank you so much for joining us and for your willingness today to be our first person. We have such little time. You have so much to share with us. We're just going to start right away, if that's okay. World War II began with Germany and Russia's invasion of Poland in September 1939. When you were born in April 1941, the city where your family lived was under Soviet occupation. I know you know very little about your family and their lives prior to your birth, but to the extent you can, share with us what you know about your family during that time before your birth.
Well, Larry and I went back to visit in October of 2013, and I saw the apartment building where I was born. Although it's being renovated, it's still standing. I also saw, well, our first hiding place, which was in a special compartment in a barn in the ghetto. But what I realized was that although my mother, birth mother, was a Jewish opera singer, in order not to be imprisoned as being bourgeois, she was listed as a factory worker. So she was a factory worker. My father was a tinsmith or plumber. I'm not sure. We were probably middle class at that point. But under the Russians, they tried to marginalize everyone. So there were not middle classes or whatever. And I don't remember that period at all. What I know about it is from my grandfather's diary, what I was told, and...
You did share with me that your mother had been an opera singer, and you shared with me that there is a particular song that you've heard that evokes for you your mother's presence.
There is a song, it's actually a Yiddish song, often pepperdick. I don't know how to say it exactly, but when I hear that tune, I remember, although I don't remember much about my mother, I remember that she felt soft, and I remember her voice singing that particular song to me, and I remember her smell, which was kind of milky, because while we were in hiding, my baby in the ghetto, my baby sister was born.
And Julie, you shared with me that you really have no memory whatsoever of your father.
Not really.
No.
Nothing about my father, except what my grandfather told me.
Right.
And what my grandfather told me was that my father was very generous, that he would give you the shirt off his back, which my father thought was bad, a grandfather thought was bad, because he expected much more of a macho guy and not somebody who was so generous. He wanted a great businessman for my mother, and she didn't marry a great businessman. So to my grandfather, she married beneath her. But I guess once we were born, he became okay. Yeah.
Nazi Germany turned on the Soviet Union in June 1941, just months after your birth. Within days, the city of Lwów was occupied by the Nazis. Your family was forced into a ghetto. What did that mean for your family, including your grandfather, Isaac?
What it meant was that we gave up everything we had, and the ghetto was in a place in Lwów that used to be slums, and Jews were just told to leave their apartments, leave everything, and go into this slum, many, many families in one room. The conditions became worse and worse and worse, and living in the ghetto was like a progressive noose that became tighter and tighter around your neck as more and more laws were passed. First, no Jew could leave the ghetto. To practice medicine, nothing. No non-Jew could enter the ghetto to practice medicine or anything else. Then there was a tax. Then there was another tax. Then it went on progressively, so that eventually people were shot when they went to get food. Bodies were piled up. Typhus was rampant. And we were hiding in this special kind of compartment.
So you actually went into hiding in the ghetto
In
itself.
the ghetto. My grandfather and father built this special compartment in a barn that hid us, yes. And I don't remember it at all.
At some point, your grandfather, Isaac, was taken by the Nazis to the Yanaska forced labor camp where thousands of Jews were killed. Do you know how your grandfather ended up being taken to Yanaska?
This was the second labor camp he was in. The first one was Yaktarov. And then Yaktarov was closed because everyone got typhus. And so all the inhabitants, everybody, was sent to, they were all sent to various hospitals. And then there was some kind of a trick. And the car, the railroad car that was supposed to take prisoners back to Yaktarov, they paid off the driver and stuff, and the prisoners wound up back in Lwów. So my grandfather went back to the ghetto and to our hiding place. Then he went out of the hiding place to go visit some friends in the ghetto. And the friends had no special hiding place. And he was picked up again. And this time he was sent to Janauska.
And for most of us, we've never heard of Janauska, an especially brutal place.
Janauska was known as the Harvard for teaching commandants how to kill and torture. 200,000 Jews were killed in Janauska in 2 years. It was the most brutal labor camp in Poland. And we don't know much about it, and one of the reasons is that unlike other camps, Janauska was liberated by the Russians. And it was liberated in 1944. Then the Ukrainians, well, the Russians made it into a prison, and then the Ukrainians kept it as a prison.
And your grandfather, while he was there, he was severely beaten, wasn't he?
He was beaten black and blue, yes, because he dared to say to the commandant that these bunks could never fit 16 men, but 8 at most. And the commandant was so upset that a Jew dared to offer an opinion that was different from his own. So he had him beaten within an inch of his life. And my grandfather was kept alive by fellow prisoners who got wet rags and put them on his body. And the next morning, when he got up for appel, which is the head count, the commandant came up to him and said, "You dog, how is it that you're still alive?"
And sometime after that, your grandfather actually escaped from Janowska, which is really remarkable. Tell us about that.
First of all, to escape, when one person escaped, 10 to 20 prisoners were shot in revenge. So it was very difficult to escape, and very, very, very few managed to escape. My grandfather was one because he became so weak from no food and terrible, hard, harsh labor and beatings that he lost close to 100 pounds. And there is a song that Janis Joplin, way before all of your time, used to sing. Freedom's just another name for nothing left to lose. And of course, my grandfather had nothing left to lose. His own wife had been sent to Balzac and exterminated. He didn't know about anybody else in his family. But he decided nothing could be worse than staying here. So he decided that he would escape, and as the new prisoners were being brought in, the gates were opened, and he ran down a hillside, and then across the street. And this this camp was called Janowska after Janov Street. And so he crossed Janov Street, and there was a huge drop-off at that point where on the bottom a train ran. So he managed to cross the street, raised his arms to jump, and just as he raised his arms, he was shot in the right hand. This was late November in Poland. It was brutally cold and snowing. He was wearing a thin concentration camp uniform with a Jewish star sewn on his jacket and on his pants, which he ripped off, and bare feet, because when prisoners came to Janowska, their clothes and shoes were taken, and they were given a uniform to wear and wooden shoes. But my grandfather had very big feet, and none of the shoes would fit, so he was barefoot. So picture in this snowing condition, very cold, running away in this thin costume, no shoes, feeling alternately hot and cold, cold from the weather, but hot from having been shot and this wound on his right hand. But he ran with the train for a while, and it happened to be a Nazi munitions train, which of course, does anybody know what munitions means? Anybody?
Oh, I think some do, yep.
Some do, okay.
Yep.
Well, munition, if you put an am in front of it, then you'll know ammunition, okay? So he ran with the train, and then eventually he stopped at the hut of a Mr. Boreski, a Polish small farmer, who fed him, cleaned him up, bandaged his hand, and then helped him, gave him food and warm clothes, and took him to a nearby forest, the Bolshevitsky forest, and gave him a shovel so he could make a kind of a ditch for himself to shield himself from the weather, but also from the Nazis.
And Julie, after Mr. Boreski did that, your grandfather's out in the forest, and eventually he joins up with other Jews who are in the forest to the point where there's a group of 30 of them that not only go into hiding, but then they began to engage in acts of sabotage and resistance against the Nazis. Tell us what you can about that, and then how you and your family became part of this group in the forest.
My grandfather had built a ditch, and pretty soon, in a couple of weeks, he describes this in his book. He heard some people speaking, and they were speaking Yiddish. So he knew they were Jews, and he came out, and one of them had a gun, and he was about to shoot him. So my grandfather said, "Don't shoot, I'm a Jew." And then grandfather showed him the hiding place, and because he had had military experience in World War I, he became the leader of these men. And it was mainly men, and they took the gun and they then started shooting the tires of Nazi munitions trucks at night. And they would bring uniforms and armaments, grenades, pistols, guns, everything, and bring it back to the tunnel. And they would also raid the Ukrainian complicitory police quarters and get uniforms, get water, get food, and bring it back to this tunnel in the woods. And of course, they made the tunnel much bigger. And that is my actual first memory of that tunnel.
And tell us how you got to the tunnel, how you ended up going to the forest.
My grandfather found out that the Nazis were going to burn the ghetto in 1943. He found that out because Mr. Boretsky was taken as a political prisoner and then was sent home from Janowska. And he was sent home because the Nazis said that they were going to burn the ghetto and they needed to make room for more workers, namely Jews. So my grandfather, finding that out, decided that he would come and get us out of the ghetto. So he commandeered a Nazi car and asked for a couple of volunteers, and all the men wanted to go, and he took just a few. They all put on their Nazi uniforms. He told them to stay on the edge of the woods. Since he knew exactly where in the ghetto we were hiding, he came and got my mother, my father, my now 5-month-old baby sister out and took us back to the tunnel. He had originally had a plan with Mr. Boretsky to hide my mother, my baby sister, and me in Mr. Boretsky's barn in a special part that they made a hiding place. But my mother said, "No, I'm not leaving what family I have left. I already lost my mother. I'm not going to lose my father. I don't want to be separated from my husband and my children." So all of us went to that tunnel.
And as you started to tell us a moment ago, Julie, that's your first actual memory. You remember the tunnel. Mm-hmm. What do you remember about it?
What I remember about it is with the eyes of a child. So to get into the tunnel, I remember a tall ladder, which with my adult eyes, I'd imagine was no more than maybe 5 feet high, out of wood, to get into the tunnel. And I remember that the walls were kind of damp, cold mud. And I remember walking around and feeling and touching the walls. I remember the smell of candle wax, because as you walked around to this so-called room made out of cold mud, which was probably maybe 12 feet long, at the opposite end of that room was a round wooden splintery table with a fat candle sitting on top. And it was many, many years later when I was an adult and I saw tables like that in the United States. And they were the kind of tables that had electric wire in them. Mm-hmm. And I was this, oh, that's what it was. Anyway, that table, then you kept walking, and there was an archway, and then another room that was considerably smaller and totally dark, except from the light from that candle. And what I remember about that is I remember walking around and about to touch something. And my grandfather yelled. Now, my grandfather never yelled at me, much less laid a hand on me, but he was about to smack me. And I was shocked, so it stopped me in my tracks. Can you kind of figure out why he was going to yell at me? Well, I'll tell you, because I was going to touch the place where all the guns and grenades were, because they were shiny and interesting looking, so I wanted to touch and feel them. And he was afraid that something would go off.
And Julie, this tunnel you've described, your grandfather and the others with him had dug that all out themselves. Yep.
And they kept extending it as more and more. They were not all from Lwów, but they came from around little towns that were near the forest.
Do you know if there were any other children in there?
There were 2 teenage girls. They were like 15 and 16.
Well, at some point, your grandfather made the decision to take you and your sister out of there. Will you tell us about that?
The thaw was coming, so people would become very, very nervous and frightened that the Nazis would find us. And it was a very difficult place to be, living underground, and you could not bathe because you could not heat the water, and you had to save the water that you got for drinking. So everybody got lice, and we were always scratching. And I was almost 3, so when my father said, "Be quiet," I was quiet. But my baby sister was 5 months old, and my mother would put her hand over her mouth to keep her quiet, and she almost smothered her. But how do you keep a 5-month-old quiet? So we made noise, and my grandfather felt that everyone has a right to live and that his grandchildren cannot cost everybody their lives. So he decided to take us out. And he took us out dressed as a Polish peasant.
And this was you and your sister, not your parents?
Not my parents. He took my sister and me, yes. My parents stayed. And he went to the Central Market disguised, big beard and everything, and one of those jackets that helps hide, sheepskin jacket that helps hide your face. And he went to the Central Market looking for Dr. Grohr, who was a professor of pediatrics, a pediatrician who ran a Catholic children's home. and he could not find him. And he describes in his diary that he became so desperate that he thought, well, because he was our grandfather, that we were little and cute, and that somebody would take us, and if he lived after the war, he would come and get us. And just as he was about there, he saw a woman who used to be a next-door neighbor of his, a Polish Catholic woman, Lucia Nowicka, and he and his wife and Lucia and her husband were very great friends and would help each other a great deal. And Lucia's husband was missing. When she went looking for him, she was told by the Nazis, "Lady, stop looking." So she knew what that meant, and she had to stop. Now, the Russians had such high taxes on people who owned buildings, as she did, that she could not afford to live where she was, and she had to give up her home, and she became a live-in housekeeper to a retired Polish engineer and his wife. And they lived way out in what you would call a suburb of Lwów, but they were very anti-Semitic. They were members of a political party that was very anti-Semitic. So when my grandfather asked Lucia, could you take the children? She said, Isaac, I don't own my home anymore. I live as a live-in housekeeper. But they made up a story between them, and the story was that she and my grandfather were a married couple. And suddenly, Isaac Eisenjew, 6'2", 225, 250, became Stanislaw Nowicki, 6'2", 225, 250, and Isaac took Stanislaw's identity papers and he could pass. So he was her husband, and he had a copy of the marriage certificate. Then my baby sister and I were supposedly her dead sister's children. That her sister, she claimed, who was Polish and Catholic, had died in a nearby town, and that Lucia had to take us to save us and bring us up.
So with those false identities and these circumstances, your grandfather now leaves you with Lucia in the home of this anti-Semitic family. He returns to the forest, to the bunker.
Well, not yet.
Okay.
He works for a while as a day laborer around to try to bring anything he can in the way of food. Mm-hmm. And then he comes back to the house periodically. Lucia then is taken for questioning by the Gestapo because someone down the street said that Lucia Nowicka was harboring Jewish children. So Lucia was taken away. Now there was an interesting thing about this house where the Schwarczynskis lived. That house was right next to the home of the Nazi governor of Lwów. So there were soldiers all over the place. So there I was, hidden in very plain sight. And by the way, here I should tell you a little story. That first picture of me that you saw when I was 3, that is not curly hair that you see in that picture. I was following Lucia, And she was going to the woods to try to find mushrooms, anything edible. But first, she was teaching me how to pick dandelions with long stems so she could make me a wreath. So she did. She made me a wreath, and I thought I was gorgeous. I looked ridiculous, but to me, I was gorgeous.
So Julie, she was taken for interrogation, Lucia, by the Nazis. What happened to her?
She was tortured.
She was tortured.
And she never told that she, in fact, was harboring Jewish children, that my grandfather was a Jew, that she knew about the Jews who were hidden in the forest. She never cracked. And my grandfather asked Mrs. Schwarczynski, who was a friend of the governor's wife and who knew Lucia, because Lucia would do some cooking and the governor's wife liked her cooking. And so Isaac asked Mrs. Schwarczynski to intercede with the governor's wife, who then went to her husband and said, you know, Lucia has been accused of taking care of Jewish kids, which is absolutely nonsense because they are members of this party. They would never have Jews. And so can you help? So he got in his command car, went to Gestapo quarters and said, I want Lucia now. And so Lucia was told to clean up, and she was sworn to secrecy, and she was brought back.
So once she's brought back, she's now taking care of you and Tola?
No, there was one thing that I forgot to say. While she was gone, Mrs. Schwarczynski had to take care of this big house.
Plus the two of you.
Plus a 3-year-old, almost 3-year-old, and a 6-month-old baby, and she couldn't do it because she was old and she had everything to do, including cooking and all. So Mr. Schwarczynski was a friend of Dr. Grohr's.
Who ran the children's orphanage.
Who ran the Catholic Children's Home. So he wrote a letter to his friend, would he please take Antonina Novitska, Catholic child of 6 months old, blonde hair, blue eyes, because she looked like my father. And so my grandfather took her to Dr. Grohr's children's home and paid for 3 months in advance and felt, wow, at least now, at least one of us would live. And he felt pretty good, and now Lucia had come back. And so he felt that at least his 2 granddaughters were fairly safe, and he would go now to the woods and check on everyone in the woods. And he went to the woods, and he noticed that the opening to the tunnel had been disturbed. And then he thought, well, maybe our own grenades had blown up or something. And then he noticed all of the bodies. And then he noticed that every body had bullet holes. So he realized that they had been betrayed and everyone had been shot.
Including your mother and father.
Including his daughter, my mother, and her husband, his son-in-law. So he said the prayer over the dead, and he buried everyone back in the tunnel, and there they remain, in that tunnel somewhere in the Bolshevitsky forest, in an unmarked grave. And when Larry and I went to visit this woods, we kept looking for depressions. Well, there were depressions all over the place. So we never did find where, in fact, they were buried.
After your grandfather found what you just described, what did he do then?
He went back to where the Schwarzinskys were. And, you know, Lucia had her own little apartment there. And this was in April, right around my birthday. And I used to wonder, as I was growing up later, why every time on my birthday, Grandpa would have tears in his eyes. And then I realized that's when my parents were killed. And this was in April. In June of 1944, the Russians came and liberated us. So then we started various DP camps. Now DP stands for displaced persons. Remember, countries kept changing borders. And so the country where you were born, like Poland, was no more. It was now the USSR, and then on and on. So we were people without a country. So we were put in displaced persons camps.
Julie, before you tell us more about that, after your liberation, tell us about Tola.
Tola was my baby. You know, some people had dolls, I had my baby. And I just remember adoring her. And I remember that suddenly she was gone. And I remember asking, where is Tola? Well, Tola is sick, so we had to take her to the doctor. Okay. A few days later, no Tola. When is Tola coming back? Well, the doctor decided that she needs to go to a hospital, and when she's all better, she'll come back. And I kept waiting for her to come back, and she didn't come back. But meanwhile, the Schwarzinskys had this huge German Shepherd, huge dog. And this was not a dog bred to be friendly. This was a guard dog. But I missed my baby sister. I didn't have anybody to play with. All of these adults were around. So one day, I decided that I would approach the dog. Now, this dog got fed with a long pole, and his dish was pushed on that long pole to him. He lived outside, did not live in the house, and he was chained to his doghouse. Well, as I say, I was lonely, so I went up to the dog, and Lucia saw me approaching the dog and was about to scream. And Mrs. Schwarzinski said, Lucia, you have to stay calm. You don't want to excite the dog. Well, meanwhile, I decided I would pet the dog. I was petting the dog, and he began licking me. And we became very close friends. And I would get on his back, and he was my pet and my pony and everything. So I would just go riding around on this dog. And now, an interesting point. When the Nazis came, my job was to take Rex under the kitchen table and keep him calm and quiet. And I never thought of it until I became an old lady. Who were they trying to save? The dog or me? I don't know. I really don't.
Julie, do you mind if I ask a bit more about Tola?
Sure.
Your grandfather tried very hard to find what happened to her. What do you know, if anything?
I know that he went to every Western country. He went to...
And the reason for that is because they hoped that the children were taken out of the orphanage and taken elsewhere,
Well,
right?
he was told at the first orphanage that the Allies had bombed the roof, so the children were moved. And he went to the second place where they were supposedly moved to, and was told that he was a little bit late, that 6 months before he came, the children were divided, there were 80 total, into 2 groups of 40 each, and the nuns, and 40 of them were taken to Western Europe, and 40 of them were taken to Hungary. Now, at that time, you could not get in or out of Hungary. It was shut tight. So he could not go there. But he went everywhere trying to find her. But how do you find a 6-month-old child whose name and religion were changed?
And Julie, you've said that
Many years
to this
later.
day, you hope that she's still there somewhere.
I hope so.
Yeah.
And I hope so.
Tell us about your grandfather and Lucia.
My grandfather was an amazing, amazing man. Not only did he have to go through an awful lot, but he had an ability to love, which at this time of turmoil and every upheaval was very rare. And he later could laugh and say, I am so rich. I have you, I have Larry, Steve, Mona. I am a wealthy man. And here's a man who lost everything and almost everybody. Being able to live life, being grateful for the little he had, and starting life over completely, including another language at age 62.
So after the war, he marries Lucia. So it's Lucia, your grandfather, and you.
He offered Lucia a lot of money because he was working and he selling clothes and stuff, and he made quite a bit. And he offered her money, and she said, Isaac, we've been a family. I want to stay a family. So they were in one of the DP camps, and he's Jewish. She is not. She's Catholic. And in order to marry her, she has to convert. So this little rabbi in the camp said, okay, she'll convert, which means she has to shave her head to get into a ritual bath to be purified. So she went to Isaac. She said, Isaac, I don't have a lot of hair. I have very little hair. And I don't want to lose that little hair that I have. So Isaac remembers this great big guy, and he could look menacing. He went up to the rabbi. He said, Rabbi, this woman is more precious than gold or silver or diamonds, and we should feel proud that she wants to be a Jew. She doesn't want to shave her head, Rabbi. Okay, Isaac, she won't shave her head. She won't shave her head. So she became a Jew and didn't shave her head.
Julie, in 1948, when you were 7, in the little time we have left, your grandfather sent you to the United States. Tell us what made that possible and what you might recall of what that was like for you, but also what it was like for your grandfather.
It was very, very hard to get visas to come to the United States, especially from Eastern Europe. There were quotas, and you could almost never get a visa to be able to come. However, every once in a while there was a strange exception. One exception was if you were an orphan born between this year and this year, you could come on an orphan's visa. So I qualified. I and my grandfather decided that living in a DP camp with no running water, no electricity, occasional heat if you could get the wood, food if you could get it, was not a place to grow up. And the United States was, of course, the place to be. It was wonderful. It was everything. So he decided he would send me to the United States. And I was put into various orphanages to have this shot and that shot, this shot. And I remember feeling terribly, terribly lonely for my grandfather, and also feeling betrayed. Because I remember we were walking by one day, and it was a gorgeous spring day, and we saw all these flowers, and then we saw this like fence, very high fence, like a wire fence, and noses peeking out of that fence, and they were all these children. And they were obviously living there. And I remember taking my grandfather's hand and saying, "Jaju, promise me you'll never leave me there." And he said, "I promise." And like a couple days later, he and Babsha took me there and left me off. And I remember being so homesick that the nuns were afraid I would die because I stopped eating. And they decided to call my grandfather and say, "You have to come." The child was very upset. So Jaju and Babsha came. And I remember Jaju gave me a China doll. It was the first toy I ever got. And he brought a bunch of oranges, which he gave to the nuns. And he found one girl who was about 5 years older than I and said, "Would you please take care of my granddaughter? She's little, and she's all I have." And the girl said, "Okay." And so she would try to do my hair. She would try to take care of me. And she became kind of like my big sister. And she was very, very special. Unfortunately, I cannot remember her name. But, yeah.
Julie, we're going to have to close the program now. I wish that we had more time. There's so much more you could not only tell us that you had to skip over, but coming to the United States, it took until you were 16, then you were adopted by a wonderful family. Lucia and your grandfather would immigrate to the United States, and then of course you built this wonderful life and family, but we're going to close the program now. We don't have time for questions from our audience, but when she finishes, and I'm going to turn back to Julie in just a moment, when she finishes, she will remain on the stage, and we invite you to come up on the
I'd
stage.
love it.
Come up on the stage. She would welcome that. Ask her questions that you didn't get to ask, or just give her a hug.
Please.
Or take a photograph, whatever you want to do. We want you to feel welcome to do that. I want to remind you that we'll have programs each Wednesday and Thursday until the middle of August. We hope you can come back. It's our tradition at First Person that our first person has the last word. And so on that note, I'd like to turn back to Julie to close our program. And again, after she finishes, invite you to come up and join her if you wish.
You know, for many, many years, I did not want to talk about my experiences. It was a whole lot of pain. But I decided that there are 6 million of my people who were forever silenced. And in my own small way, I had to speak for them. And say, yes, first of all, the Holocaust did take place because I was in it. And second of all, I don't want this to happen to any other child ever, because it was very, very painful. But above all, I really like speaking to young people because you are remarkable. You're not afraid to take a stand and stand up for what you believe. And that we have to have. You have to take a stand. You cannot turn the other way when you see injustice and unfairness. And I'd like to end with a quote you'll see all over this museum. It was written by a Lutheran pastor, and he said, first they came for the communists, but I was not a communist, so I didn't do anything. This is, by the way, loosely translated. Then they came for the trade unionists, but I was not a trade unionist, so I just stayed there. Then they came for the Jews, but I was not a Jew, so I didn't do anything. Then they came for me, and there was no one there to stand for me. Now, just more concretely, if you see bullying and you witness it, the strongest thing that you can do is make a friend of the person who was bullied, because they are all alone and everybody has picked on them. And you are taking a very courageous stand. You are going against the crowd. You are doing a right thing. And you have to do what you know in your heart, in your mind, is the right thing, because you have to look at yourself in the mirror every day. And I know you do that. And I'm so proud that I get a chance to at least speak to you all. Thank you.